What if feeling stuck is not a lack of motivation? What if it is resistance to an identity update? I want to start there because we use the word stuck so casually that we rarely stop to ask what it actually means. We assume a person is stuck because they are afraid, unmotivated, undisciplined, overwhelmed, or trapped in an old pattern. Sometimes that is true, but I think there is another possibility. What if the old pattern is not the cause? What if it is the result of something deeper? What if life has already delivered new information about who you are, what you are capable of, or what your life now requires, but the identity you are currently operating from has refused to accept the update? Think about how often this happens. A person loses a tremendous amount of weight, but still sees themselves through the identity of the larger body. Someone gets promoted but still feels like the least qualified person in the room. A relationship ends, but years later the person is still psychologically organized around the role they held inside that relationship. Someone retires, but cannot separate their worth from the job they had. Someone succeeds beyond anything they expected, yet continues to define themselves through failure. The facts have changed, the evidence has changed, reality has changed, but identity has not. That is what led me to what I call identity update theory. The basic idea is simple. Identity is maintained not only through habits, memories, scripts, and beliefs, but through the selective acceptance, weighting, rejection, and integration of information about ourselves. In other words, identity does not simply absorb experience. Identity may decide which experiences are allowed to count. That means you can have 20 pieces of evidence showing that you are changing, and one piece of evidence confirming the old version of you, and the old version still wins. You can exercise consistently for 6 months and still say, "I'm not disciplined." You can receive praise from 10 people and dismiss every compliment as politeness. You can complete something difficult and say, "I just got lucky." You can become healthier, stronger, more stable, more successful, and more capable, and still say, "That's not really me." That is not just negativity. That may be resistance, and resistance is often subtle. Sometimes it appears as discounting. That doesn't really count. The success happened, but you strip it of meaning before it can change anything about how you see yourself. Sometimes it appears as reinterpretation. Yes, I succeeded, but only because they made it easy. The evidence is accepted, but translated through the old identity so the old conclusion can survive. Sometimes it appears as deflection. The conversation moves too close to a meaningful realization, and suddenly there is humor, irritation, distraction, or a subject change. Sometimes it appears as behavioral reversal. You make progress, then do something that restores the old pattern. We call that self-sabotage, but I wonder if some forms of self-sabotage are actually identity restoration. The new behavior created a contradiction, so the system recreates familiar evidence. Sometimes resistance is environmental. You return to people, places, roles, or routines where the old version of you is still recognized. There is comfort in being around people who expect you to remain who you were, because they hand your old identity back to you. Sometimes resistance appears in the way you imagine your future. You can see the healthier person, the confident person, the peaceful person, the successful person. You can picture them clearly and still say, "That could never really be me." That is future self-distancing. The future is imaginable, but not inhabitable. Sometimes resistance hides in language. "I've always been this way. That's just who I am. I'm not the kind of person who does that." Those sentences sound descriptive, but they can function like code. They create fixed rules around which kinds of evidence are allowed to change the identity. One of the clearest forms of resistance is evidence asymmetry. Negative evidence is accepted immediately. Positive evidence is placed under investigation. One failure proves you are inconsistent. 20 successes somehow prove nothing. Then there is threshold raising. I'll believe I've changed when I lose another 20 pounds, when I finish the degree, when I make more money, when I keep this up for another year. Every time the threshold is reached, the system quietly moves it. The update remains pending. And then there is one of the most revealing statements of all. I know it intellectually, but I don't feel it. That sentence fascinates me, because maybe that is what an update looks like when it has been cognitively received, but not autobiographically integrated. The information arrived, the update did not install. That is why the computer metaphor works so well. Imagine life constantly generating identity-relevant updates. Some are minor patches, some are full system upgrades. A new reality appears, and your identity performs a compatibility check. If the information fits with the existing version, integration is easy. If it does not, something has to give. Either the identity changes, or the evidence gets rejected. And people can live for years with updates waiting to install. The job is gone, but the identity still says, "I am my title." The body has changed, but the identity still says, "I am the person I used to see in the mirror." The danger is over, but the identity still says, "I must survive." Success is happening, but the identity still says, "I am a failure." Life changed. Over time, that may create what I call identity version divergence. That is the gap between the version of yourself you keep defending and the version reality has made possible. The larger that gap becomes, the more energy it may take to maintain the old configuration. More denial, more rigidity, more repetition, more defensiveness, more explaining, more returning to the same environments, more recreating the same evidence. The person says, "I feel stuck," but perhaps what they are experiencing is not immobility. Perhaps they are experiencing incompatibility. The current identity architecture no longer fits the life they are actually living. That leads to another idea I find really interesting. What if "I don't know who I am anymore" is not always an identity crisis? What if sometimes it is good news? Imagine someone says, "Well, I guess I'm new today because I don't know who I am." We usually hear collapse. But what if that sentence means the old identity has finally lost authority? The person is no longer willing to pretend they are who they used to be, but the new identity has not stabilized yet. That creates a temporary gap, an identity update gap. The old version is gone, the new version is still integrating, and that can feel deeply uncomfortable. But maybe confusion is sometimes the first evidence that resistance has ended. "I don't know who I am anymore" may actually mean I am no longer willing to lie about who I have become. That is a very different interpretation. And then the question becomes much bigger. What exactly is being updated? If identity is only memory and belief, then maybe the answer is straightforward. But consciousness itself is not straightforward. We know that neural development matters. We know that injury to the brain can change memory, personality, and conscious experience. We know that development changes what humans are capable of perceiving and understanding. But one of the deepest questions remains. Why is there an interior experience at all? Why is there something it is like to be you? And what if consciousness does not begin with the body in the way we usually assume? What if the body is not the creator of I, but the place where I becomes locally expressed? This is where I move from psychology into speculation. And I want to be clear that this part is conceptual. What if conception initiates a unique localized expression of consciousness? What if that embodied expression functions as what I call a sentient receptor? Think of it as sentient receptor version 1, SRV1. The receptor is alive, but its capacity is limited. It does not yet have language. It does not have mature reasoning. It does not have a fully developed autobiographical identity. It cannot understand all the information an adult can process. So perhaps the information available to the receptor is developmentally staged. As the biological system matures, the bandwidth expands. The architecture becomes more complex. The receptor becomes capable of processing more. Now consider the possibility that the receptor is not standalone. What if it remains linked to some higher order consciousness or intelligence? Not controlled like a puppet, not programmed like a machine, but connected. A locally autonomous expression of something larger. If that were true, then life events might not only be random circumstances we interpret after the fact. Some of them might function as developmental information, patches, updates. Loss might contain information. Love might contain information. Failure might contain information. Success might contain information. Insight might contain information. A dream might contain information. A repeated internal pull towards something may contain information. Again, I am not saying we can prove that. I am asking whether it is worth considering, because if the receptor is connected, then the experience of life becomes more than accumulation. It becomes exchange. Information is received, it is interpreted, it is integrated, it is expressed, and then something is transmitted back into the world. That leads to another uncomfortable question. Why is resistance possible at all? Maybe the choice is evolve or become increasingly incompatible with what life now requires. What if resistance creates divergence? What if the more we cling to an outdated identity, the more energy the system must spend defending it? And what if that has a cost? I want to be careful here. I am not saying that illness, aging, or disease are caused by spiritual resistance. That would be irresponsible. But we already know that prolonged stress, chronic conflict, isolation, and maladaptive behavior can affect the body. So the question I am asking goes one step further. What if a receptor that continually rejects necessary developmental information becomes increasingly rigid and less capable of coherent expression? Maybe the source remains intact. Maybe the connection remains intact. What degrades is the local operating system. The receptor becomes noisy, rigid, less adaptable, less curious, less capable of integrating what life is trying to teach it. And here's the really provocative part. What if that degradation is built into the architecture, not as punishment, as consequence? Maybe the system does not punish us for refusing to evolve. Maybe the inability to remain unchanged is simply built into being alive. That idea sounds strangely familiar, because when I started following this line of thought, I kept hearing the Bible in the background. Genesis begins with humanity in relationship with God. There is freedom. There is a prohibition. There is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And after the fruit is eaten, something changes. Humans become aware of themselves in a different way. There is nakedness, shame, covering, hiding, blame, separation. I am not claiming that this is the definitive meaning of Genesis. I am asking a question. What if the tree of knowledge can be read, at least metaphorically, as the emergence of the defended autobiographical self? Before the fruit, there is being. After the fruit, there is judgment. Good and bad, worthy and unworthy, safe and unsafe, mine and yours, comparison, control, fear. What if embodied life becomes a field of resistance? Not because the world itself is evil, but because meaningful agency requires the possibility of misalignment. And if you keep reading Scripture, the developmental language is everywhere. Renew, transform, grow, mature, love, serve, bear fruit, use your gifts, become. That sounds less like a static identity model and more like a developmental one. Maybe the point is not simply to discover who you are at freeze there. Maybe the point is to keep becoming, and that changes the meaning of purpose. What if purpose is not simply your job or your career? What if purpose is the increasingly clear expression of the unique I that is becoming available through this life? Maybe your gifts are not just talents. Maybe they are transmission channels. You receive experience, you interpret it, you give it meaning, you integrate it, you express it, and then you give something back. A child raised differently, a book, a lesson, an invention, a friendship, a kindness, a healed relationship, a story, a contribution. Maybe life is not simply a download. Maybe it is a loop. Receive, interpret, integrate, express, transmit. And then we get to the biggest question of all. What if the point of life is not accumulation? What if it is development? What if we are here to live, love, express, evolve, contribute, and eventually release the biological receptor? If consciousness is entirely produced by the brain, death would appear to end the local experience. But if consciousness is more fundamental, death may be the end of embodiment rather than the end of I. Call that ascension. Call it return. Call it reunion. Call it resurrection. Call it something we do not yet understand. I do not know, and I think it is important to say that. This is not a declaration of certainty. It is a conceptual meditation, a theory of I. But I keep coming back to one thought. Maybe the strangest assumption we have made is that the version of ourselves currently running is supposed to stay installed forever. Maybe it is not. Maybe life has been sending the message for years. Maybe the discomfort you feel is not always evidence that something is wrong. Maybe it is evidence that the architecture has changed. Maybe the person you keep trying to restore has already completed their work. Maybe your confusion is not proof that you have lost yourself. Maybe you finally stopped resisting. And maybe the question that matters most is not who you were, or who everyone else says you are, or even who you have always believed yourself to be. Maybe the question is simpler. Who are you today? And maybe the system message has been there all along.